On January 26, 1943, somewhere in the waters off New Guinea, a Japanese convoy sailed toward its destination with no idea that death was stalking from below. The transport Buyomaru carried over 1,100 Japanese soldiers, along with nearly 300 Indian prisoners of war who had been captured when Singapore fell. By nightfall, the ship would be at the bottom of the ocean, and the submarine that sank her would be running on the surface, hunting for more targets like a wolf among sheep. The commander of that submarine was a 35-year-old Kentuckian named Dudley Walker Morton. His nickname was Mush. His philosophy was simple: find the enemy, kill him. His crew called him the most aggressive submarine commander in the United States Navy. The Japanese would learn to fear the name of his boat, USS Wahoo, and the admirals back in Pearl Harbor were about to discover that everything they thought they knew about submarine warfare was catastrophically wrong. 7,000 miles away in Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance was insisting that American torpedoes worked perfectly. 7,000 miles away in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Charles Lockwood was reviewing patrol reports that showed submarine after submarine returning with empty logs. The American submarine force that was supposed to strangle Japan's war economy was barely drawing blood. And the men who could have fixed the problems refused to believe the problems existed. Morton was about to prove them all wrong in the most dramatic way possible. In the first year of the Pacific War, American submarines had failed catastrophically. The numbers told a damning story. The United States Navy possessed the largest submarine force in the Pacific, over 50 fleet boats and dozens of older vessels. These submarines were supposed to sever Japan's supply lines, to sink the tankers bringing oil from the Dutch East Indies, to destroy the freighters carrying raw materials from conquered territories back to Japanese factories. Without oil, without steel, without rubber, Japan could not sustain a modern war. But the submarines were sinking almost nothing. Commanders returned from patrol after patrol, reporting multiple attacks with zero results. Torpedoes that should have sent enemy ships to the bottom either missed entirely, exploded prematurely, or struck their targets and failed to detonate. Morale was collapsing throughout the submarine force. Officers who had trained for years found themselves unable to achieve what should have been routine kills. The weapon that was supposed to bring Japan to its knees was instead embarrassing itself. The problem was not the boats themselves. American fleet submarines were excellent vessels, among the best in the world. The Gato-class boats like Wahoo displaced over 1,500 tons on the surface, could cruise at 20 knots, and carried 24 torpedoes in 10 tubes. They had range, speed, and firepower. What they lacked was everything else. The problem was doctrine. The problem was leadership. The problem was defective weapons that nobody in Washington wanted to admit were broken. And the problem was a generation of submarine commanders trained to be cautious in a war that demanded aggression. American submarine doctrine had been designed for a war that would never happen. Pre-war training taught submariners to serve as scouts for the battle fleet. They were supposed to operate submerged throughout daylight hours, stay hidden from enemy detection, avoid unnecessary risk, and fire cautiously from depth at targets of opportunity. The London Naval Treaty had restricted attacks on merchant shipping, and American naval planners had embraced caution as the highest virtue. Risk was to be minimized. Ships were to be preserved. The submarine's job was to survive first and fight second. Only 5 of 126 pre-war fleet exercises even featured submarines in a meaningful offensive role. The games assumed that submarines would provide reconnaissance, report enemy positions, and perhaps attack warships if the opportunity presented itself safely. The idea of submarines as commerce raiders, as weapons of economic strangulation, barely existed in American naval thinking. Peacetime training actually punished aggressive behavior. An officer who took risks, who pressed attacks into dangerous waters, who exposed his boat to possible counterattack, was marked as reckless. The system rewarded commanders who kept their ships safe, who avoided incidents, who returned from exercises with their hulls undamaged and their careers intact. The men who rose to command submarines in 1941 had spent their entire careers learning that caution was wisdom. Then came December 7, 1941. Hours after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the Navy issued orders for unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. All previous restrictions were lifted. Submarines were authorized to sink any enemy vessel, military or merchant, without warning. The gloves were off. But the men commanding American submarines had spent 15 or 20 years learning to keep those gloves firmly on. They had been trained to survive, not to kill. They had been promoted for being careful, not for being aggressive. And the torpedoes they carried into battle were about to betray them in ways that would cost lives and extend the war. The Mark 14 torpedo was one of the worst weapons ever issued to American fighting men. It suffered from 3 separate catastrophic defects that took 21 months to fully identify and correct. And throughout that entire period, the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington denied that any problems existed and blamed submarine commanders for the failures. The first problem was depth control. The Mark 14 ran 10 to 11 feet deeper than its depth setting. A torpedo set to run at 10 feet would actually run at 20 feet, passing harmlessly beneath the keel of its target. Submarine commanders who thought they were making perfect attacks were actually sending their torpedoes under the ships they were trying to sink. The second problem was the Mark 6 magnetic exploder. This device was designed to detonate the torpedo beneath a ship's keel, where the explosion would break the vessel's back and cause maximum damage. The Mark 6 was so secret that maintenance manuals were never printed. Submarine crews were forbidden from testing or adjusting the devices. They were simply ordered to load the torpedoes and trust that the exploders would work. They did not work. The magnetic exploder caused premature detonations in some latitudes and complete failures in others. The Earth's magnetic field varied from place to place, and the Mark 6 had been calibrated for conditions that did not exist in the combat zones where American submarines actually operated. Torpedoes exploded hundreds of yards short of their targets or failed to explode at all. The third problem was discovered only after submarine commanders, on their own initiative, began deactivating the magnetic exploders and relying on contact detonation instead. The contact exploder was also defective. The firing pin was designed so poorly that it crushed on impact from deceleration. The faster and more directly a torpedo struck its target, the more likely the exploder was to fail. A perfect 90-degree hit, the kind of shot that should guarantee destruction, was actually the most likely to produce a dud. The results were devastating beyond comprehension. Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit in USS Tenosa found a large tanker dead in the water in July 1943. He had already hit her with 2 torpedoes that worked. She was motionless, helpless, unable to escape or evade. Daspit fired 11 more torpedoes at point-blank range. 9 were duds. He saved his last 2 torpedoes to bring back as evidence of the defects. Lieutenant Commander John Scott in USS Tunney encountered 3 Japanese aircraft carriers in April 1943. He achieved textbook perfect setups, the kind of firing solutions that submariners dreamed about. He fired all 10 tubes, not a single torpedo hit. The carriers sailed on untouched. These were not isolated incidents. They happened patrol after patrol, boat after boat, throughout 1942 and into 1943. Submarine commanders who complained were told the problem was their technique. The Bureau of Ordnance conducted tests under ideal conditions that bore no resemblance to combat operations and declared the torpedoes perfect. When evidence of defects accumulated beyond denial, the Bureau blamed inadequate maintenance, improper storage, and crew incompetence. It took direct intervention from Admiral Charles Lockwood, who commanded submarines in the Pacific, to force the bureaucracy to acknowledge what every submarine skipper already knew. Lockwood ordered his own tests using live torpedoes fired at underwater cliffs. The tests proved conclusively that the torpedoes ran deep, that the magnetic exploders failed, and that the contact exploders were defective. One by one, the problems were fixed. But the fixes did not come until the fall of 1943, almost 2 years into the war. Those 2 years of defective weapons cost ships that should have been sunk, lives that should have been saved, and a war that should have ended sooner. But defective torpedoes were only part of the problem. The other part was the men giving orders. Peacetime selection criteria valued administrative competence and safety over combat effectiveness. The submarine force was led by officers who had risen through a system that punished risk-taking and rewarded caution. When war came, many of these commanders could not adapt to the demands of actual combat. They made cautious approaches, starting attacks from maximum range where the probability of hitting was lowest. They broke off attacks at the first sign of counterattack, diving deep and running away from opportunities. They followed doctrine that said to fire 2 torpedoes and then assess results, rather than firing enough weapons to guarantee destruction. They returned from patrol, having achieved nothing, offering excuses that command was increasingly unwilling to accept. By the end of 1942, approximately 30% of submarine commanders had been relieved. The force was filtering out captains who followed cautious doctrine too closely, who could not or would not adapt to the aggressive warfare that victory required. What remained was a desperate need for a new kind of leader, someone who would show the submarine force what real warfare actually looked like. That man was Dudley Morton. Morton was born on July 17, 1907, in Owensboro, Kentucky, a river town on the Ohio, where steamboats still came and went with the seasons. His father, William Dix Morton, worked in the coal mines of Davis County. His mother was Elizabeth Rebecca Rowe. The family moved several times during Morton's childhood, from Owensboro to DeKoven to Nortonville in Hopkins County, before finally settling in Miami, Florida, during his high school years. Morton graduated from Miami High School in June 1926 and entered the United States Naval Academy on June 23 of that year. He was appointed from Florida's 4th Congressional District. At Annapolis, he played varsity football all 4 years and wrestled for the Navy team. His classmates remembered him as physically imposing, with massive hands that could crush any hand offered in a handshake, a large square jaw, and what one contemporary called the hawk-like gaze of a Viking. The nickname Mush came from the popular comic strip Moon Mullins, created by Frank Willard, which featured a character named Mushmouth with a prominent mouth and chin. Classmates applied the shortened version to Morton because of his distinctive jaw and his Kentucky drawl, combined with what his future chief Yeoman Forrest Sterling called a knack for yarn spinning. Morton could tell stories for hours. He had the gift of making men listen to him, believe in him, and follow him anywhere. Morton graduated and was commissioned an ensign on June 5, 1930. He served on surface ships initially, including duty aboard the cruiser USS Chicago, from her commissioning in 1931. He completed submarine instruction at the submarine school in New London, Connecticut in 1933. He served aboard the old submarine S-37 in the Asiatic Fleet from 1934 to 1937. learning the cramped and dangerous trade of undersea warfare in the waters around the Philippines and China. He earned his first command with USS R-5, an ancient submarine from the First World War era, in August 1940. He commanded R-5 until April 1942, then briefly commanded USS Dolphin at Pearl Harbor while that boat underwent extended repairs. On May 5, 1936, he married Harriet Rose Nelson in Tsingtao, China. They had 2 children, a son named Douglas, born on October 9, 1939, at Portsmouth Naval Hospital, and a daughter named Edwina, born on November 5, 1941, in Norfolk. By December 1942, Morton was assigned as prospective commanding officer aboard USS Wahoo. This meant he would ride along on her current patrol, learning the boat and the crew, and then assume command when they returned to port. He joined Wahoo for her second patrol under Lieutenant Commander Marvin Kennedy. Kennedy was a cautious commander of the type that 1942 was weeding out. He declined to press second attacks after being depth-charged. He broke off engagements that Morton believed should have been pushed harder. He avoided risks that Morton saw as acceptable. Morale aboard Wahoo had sunk to dangerous levels. The executive officer, Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, was so frustrated that he was considering requesting a transfer off the boat. Wahoo had completed 2 patrols with minimal results. Her first patrol under Kennedy produced 0 confirmed sinkings, despite multiple contacts. A Japanese carrier had been allowed to escape due to what observers called an approach lacking aggressiveness and skill. Her second patrol yielded 1 confirmed sinking, the collier Kamoi Maru at 5,300 tons. Morton watched all of this and took notes. He saw what was wrong. He knew how to fix it. Morton assumed command of USS Wahoo on December 31, 1942, in Brisbane, Australia. He was about to transform the boat into the most feared submarine in the Pacific. He was about to rewrite the rules of undersea warfare. Wahoo herself was a Gato-class fleet submarine, hull number SS-238, built at Mare Island Navy Yard in California. Her keel was laid on June 28, 1941. She was launched on February 14, 1942, and commissioned on May 15 of that year. She measured 311 feet 10 inches in length, with a beam of 27 feet 4 inches. She displaced 1,525 tons on the surface and 2,424 tons submerged. Her diesel engines could push her to 20¼ knots on the surface. Submerged on her electric motors, she could make 8¾ knots. She carried 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, with storage for 24 Mark 14 torpedoes. Her deck armament included a 4-inch gun and multiple machine guns. She had a crew of approximately 60 officers and men. She was a weapon of war, designed to sink ships and kill enemies. Under Morton, she would finally fulfill that purpose. Morton's revolution began with a simple observation that challenged everything submarine commanders were taught. Under standard doctrine, the captain performed multiple simultaneous tasks during a submerged attack. He operated the periscope, raising and lowering it to minimize exposure time. He made firing calculations in his head, computing angles and distances. He gave orders to the steersman and the diving officer. He plotted courses and tracked the target's movement. He was doing the work of several men while trying to make life or death decisions in seconds, with one eye pressed to a periscope that gave him a tiny window on the world above. Morton recognized that this was insane. No man could do all of those things well at the same time. Something had to give, and usually what gave was the quality of decision-making. Morton reversed the arrangement. He assigned his executive officer, Richard O'Kane, to man the periscope and call out observations. O'Kane would describe what he saw. He would report bearings and ranges and the target's behavior. Morton would stand nearby in the conning tower, receiving this information, analyzing the tactical picture, and making decisions without the distraction of peering through a tiny lens. Morton explained his reasoning to O'Kane at submarine school. Two underway instructors observing training attacks could concentrate solely on conning the boat. They did not have to operate the periscope themselves. They could focus entirely on tactics and decision-making. They almost always arrived at better submarine maneuvers and more quickly than a single officer trying to do everything at once. By delegating periscope duties, Morton freed himself to consider what he called the broad view. He could think about the overall tactical situation rather than getting lost in the details of one particular observation. He could make better risk assessments because he was not caught up in the immediate pressure of operating the scope. He told O'Kane simply, "This way, I will never get scared." Morton's second innovation was even more radical. Standard doctrine demanded daytime submerged patrols. Submarines were supposed to hide beneath the surface from dawn to dusk, surfacing only at night to recharge their batteries and refresh their air. The assumption was that daylight surface operations were suicidal. Aircraft would spot them. Patrol boats would find them. Morton threw this out. He cruised on the surface during daylight with additional lookouts posted, maximizing his search radius and his ability to pursue contacts. A submerged submarine could see only a few miles through its periscope. A surfaced submarine with lookouts using binoculars could spot smoke on the horizon at 20 miles or more. By staying on the surface, Morton found more targets, and his willingness to chase those targets on the surface, running at 20 knots instead of crawling at 8, meant he could close with enemies that would have escaped a more cautious commander. Morton's philosophy crystallized in the address he gave his crew before their first patrol under his command. He gathered them together and spoke with the Kentucky drawl that had earned him his nickname. "Wahoo is expendable," he told them. "We will take every reasonable precaution, but our mission is to sink enemy shipping. That is what we are here to do. Every smoke trace on the horizon, every contact on watch will be investigated. If it turns out to be the enemy, we are going to hunt him down and kill him. There will be no more running from contacts. There will be no more breaking off attacks. We will close with the enemy and destroy him." He posted placards throughout the boat in bright red letters that read, "Shoot the sons of bitches." The message was impossible to miss. This was not going to be a cautious boat. This was going to be a killing machine. When Morton finished his speech, he made an offer. Anyone who was uncomfortable with this approach, anyone who did not want to serve under a commander who intended to take the risks that aggressive warfare required, could request a transfer with no questions asked and no mark on their record. Not one crew member requested to stay behind. Wahoo departed Brisbane on January 16, 1943, for her third patrol, Morton's first as commander. The boat headed for the waters off New Guinea's north coast. What happened over the next 3 weeks would become legend in the submarine force. On January 24th, Morton did something no American submarine commander had ever done before. Using a chart improvised from an Australian school atlas that a crewman had purchased in a bookshop, Morton took Wahoo into Wewak Harbour. He penetrated a Japanese anchorage, threading his way past patrol boats and shore defences into waters where American submarines were not supposed to go. This was the first American submarine to enter an enemy-held harbour during the Pacific War. The risks were enormous. Inside a harbour there was no room to manoeuvre, no depth to hide in, no escape route if things went wrong. Japanese patrol craft could corner them. Shore batteries could fire on them. Morton went anyway. He believed there would be targets inside, and targets were what he was hunting. Inside the harbour, Morton found the Japanese destroyer Harusame of the Shiratsuyu class. When the destroyer spotted Wahoo and charged directly at her, Morton held his ground. Standard doctrine said to dive deep and evade. A destroyer charging at a submarine was a deadly threat. Her depth charges could crush a boat at close range. Every submarine commander was trained to run from this situation. Morton had a different idea. He fired torpedoes directly at the approaching warship from approximately 750 yards. This was the down-the-throat shot, firing at a vessel charging bow on, a tactic so dangerous that most commanders refused to even consider it. The closing speed between the submarine and the oncoming destroyer left almost no room for error. The torpedo had to run true. It had to detonate. If it missed or failed, the destroyer would be on top of them in seconds. Morton's torpedo hit. The blast struck Harusame and stopped her charge dead in the water. The destroyer was heavily damaged, her keel nearly broken, and had to be beached on the shore of Wewak Harbour to prevent her from sinking. Morton believed he had sunk her outright, and his patrol report would claim the kill. But post-war Japanese records revealed that Harusame survived. She was eventually towed to Truk for emergency repairs and returned to service, only to be finally sunk by Army B-25 bombers near Manokwari in June 1944. The distinction mattered little in the moment. What mattered was that Morton had proven the down-the-throat shot could work. A tactic that cautious commanders dismissed as suicidal, that the tactical manuals warned against, had just been executed successfully for the first time by an American submarine in the war. Word of Morton's audacity would spread through the submarine force. Other commanders would study his methods and adopt them. 2 days later, on January 26, Morton found a convoy. What followed was a running battle lasting over 10 hours that demonstrated what a single aggressive submarine could accomplish against multiple targets. Morton attacked the transport Buyomaru at 5,400 tons, the cargo ship Fukemaru No. 2 at 1,900 tons, and another cargo vessel. He fired torpedoes, surfaced to pursue, dove to attack again, and surfaced once more. He chased the convoy relentlessly, refusing to let any ship escape. When it was over, Morton had destroyed the entire convoy. Wahoo was the first submarine to accomplish this alone, but the aftermath of the attack would haunt Morton's legacy. After the ships went down, Morton surfaced to find the water filled with survivors on rafts and clinging to debris. What happened next remains controversial to this day. Admiral Lockwood later reported that survivors had fired first at Wahoo with machine guns taken from the sinking ships. O'Kane claimed that Wahoo's fire was directed at the boats themselves, not at individuals, attempting to destroy the rafts and force troops into the water, rather than allowing them to reach shore and fight again as ground forces. What Morton did not know was that many of those survivors were not Japanese soldiers at all. They were Indian prisoners of war from the 2nd Battalion, 16th Punjab Regiment, men who had been captured when Singapore fell to the Japanese in February 1942. Of those aboard Buyomaru, 195 Indians and 87 Japanese died from torpedoing and gunfire combined. O'Kane later believed this incident prevented Morton from receiving the Medal of Honor. But in January 1943, Morton returned to port, a hero. He had proven that American submarines could fight aggressively and win. Wahoo's 3rd Patrol earned Morton the Navy Cross and the Army Distinguished Service Cross from General Douglas MacArthur for the Wewak Harbour penetration. For his 4th Patrol, Morton took Wahoo somewhere no American submarine had gone before. The Yellow Sea, the shallow waters between China and Korea, presented challenges that made most submarine commanders refuse to enter. The average depth was only 120 feet. In many places it was shallower still. A submarine that dove in the Yellow Sea had nowhere to hide. There was no deep water to escape into, no thermal layers to hide beneath. Japanese patrol boats and aircraft covered the area heavily precisely because the Japanese believed no submarine would dare to operate there. It was considered safe water for Japanese shipping. Morton went anyway. He went because the Japanese did not expect him to go, and that meant targets would be plentiful and unprepared. The fourth patrol lasted from February 23 to April 6, 1943, 43 days of hunting in waters where Wahoo could be trapped at any moment, operating in what the crew called Sampan Alley, the narrow channels where small coastal vessels carried cargo between ports. Morton combined torpedo attacks against larger ships with aggressive deck gun actions against anything that floated. The results were spectacular beyond anything the submarine force had previously achieved. 9 ships went down during the 4th patrol: Zogan Maru on March 19, Hosan Maru and Nitsu Maru on March 21, Takaosan Maru and Teisho Maru on March 23, Satsuki Maru on March 25, Yamabato Maru on March 29. When torpedoes ran erratically, Morton used battle surface tactics, bringing Wahoo up in daylight and engaging targets with his deck gun. When regular ammunition ran low, crewmen threw Molotov cocktails at sampans, improvised firebombs that had been gifts from Marines at Midway Island. If it was Japanese and it floated, Morton intended to sink it. This was the second best patrol by any American submarine in the entire Pacific War, measured by number of ships sunk. The Japanese High Command believed that an entire wolf pack was operating in the Yellow Sea. They tied up shipping throughout the region, diverting escorts, deploying additional aircraft, hunting for the pack of submarines that must be responsible for such destruction. There was only one submarine. There was only Wahoo. There was only Morton and his crew, operating alone in shallow waters where help could never reach them, sinking everything they found. Morton's 5th patrol took Wahoo to the waters off the Kuril Islands and northeast Honshu from April 25 to May 21, 1943. Despite continuing torpedo problems that reduced effectiveness by half, with many torpedoes running erratically or failing to detonate, Morton conducted 10 attacks on 8 targets in just 10 days. 3 more ships went down: Tamon Maru No. 5, Takao Maru, Jimu Maru. After the 5th patrol, Executive Officer Richard O'Kane detached from Wahoo to take command of his own submarine, USS Tang. O'Kane had served under Morton for 3 consecutive patrols. He had learned everything the Kentuckian could teach him about aggressive warfare. He had watched Morton demonstrate that courage and audacity could overcome the limitations that cautious doctrine accepted as immutable. O'Kane would apply those lessons to become the most successful submarine commander of the entire Pacific War. Tang would sink 33 ships totaling over 116,000 tons, surpassing Morton's own record. O'Kane would receive the Medal of Honor after Tang was sunk by her own malfunctioning torpedo on October 24, 1944. The torpedo had made a circular run and come back to strike the submarine that fired it. O'Kane was blown off the bridge into the water and survived as a prisoner of war. He lived to write about his experiences and to advocate for the men who had served with him. He always credited Morton with teaching him how to fight, with showing him what aggressive submarine warfare looked like in practice rather than in theory. The 3 consecutive patrols under Morton had produced staggering results. No other submarine in the Navy had achieved anything close in such a short period. But the 6th patrol proved that even the most aggressive commander could not overcome defective weapons. Wahoo departed Pearl Harbor for the Sea of Japan in August 1943. This was perhaps the most dangerous water in the Pacific for American submarines, surrounded by Japanese home islands, heavily patrolled by aircraft and surface vessels, accessible only through narrow straits. that could be mined or guarded. Morton intended to prove that Wahoo could operate even there. Within 4 days of entering Japanese waters, Morton sighted multiple targets. He attacked 9 ships with textbook approaches, perfect firing solutions, ideal conditions. He achieved 0 sinkings. 10 torpedoes broached or ran erratically. Others hit their targets and failed to detonate. The curse of the Mark 14 had finally caught up with Wahoo in the worst possible place. Every torpedo failure meant a target that escaped, an alarm that was raised, a hunt that would begin for the submarine that had just revealed its position. Morton was profoundly upset. He had taken his boat into the most dangerous water in the Pacific, had found targets everywhere he looked, and could not sink any of them because his weapons betrayed him. He requested permission from Submarine Command to stay and continue trying. The submarine force commander ordered Wahoo home. The boat was too valuable to lose in waters where her weapons did not function. Morton reluctantly complied. Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor with her crew, wearing the dejected air peculiar to a highly successful submarine that suddenly could not make her torpedoes run true. They had done everything right. They had found the enemy. They had attacked. And they had nothing to show for it because the Bureau of Ordnance had sent them to war with defective weapons. But the torpedo problems were finally being fixed. Admiral Lockwood had personally supervised tests that proved what every submarine skipper already knew. By the fall of 1943, the problems were being corrected. Contact exploders were redesigned, depth settings were adjusted. For the first time since the war began, American submarines would have weapons that actually worked. For Morton's 7th Patrol, he would finally have torpedoes he could trust. Wahoo departed Pearl Harbor on September 9, 1943, with a stop at Midway to top off fuel and supplies. Then Morton took his boat back to the Sea of Japan, back to the waters where the 6th Patrol had failed, back to prove that the failure had been the torpedoes and not the crew. He entered through Atorofu Strait and began hunting in waters that the Japanese believed were safe. This time the torpedoes worked. This time the targets died. On September 21, Wahoo sank Hokusei Maru. On September 25, Taiko Maru went down. On September 29, Masaki Maru No. 2. The pace of destruction accelerated as Morton ranged through waters the Japanese thought were beyond the reach of American submarines. Then came October 5, and a sinking that would seal Wahoo's fate. The transport Konron Maru was a substantial vessel of nearly 8,000 tons. She was carrying passengers as well as cargo, including 2 members of the Japanese Diet, the national legislature. Congressman Choichi Kato and Keishiro Sukakawa were aboard on government business. Morton's torpedoes found Konron Maru and sent her to the bottom. 544 people died, including the 2 legislators. The Domei News Agency, Japan's official wire service, announced the sinking publicly. The loss humiliated the Japanese Navy, which had assured the nation that home waters were safe. Maizuru Naval District ordered a full search and destroy operation to find and kill the submarine that was terrorizing the Sea of Japan. Morton kept hunting. He did not know that the Japanese were mobilizing everything they had to find him. On October 6, Kanko Maru went down. On October 9, Hanko Maru joined the growing list of ships Morton had sent to the bottom. Wahoo had sunk 6 ships during the 7th Patrol, adding over 17,000 tons to her already impressive total. Morton was proving what he had always believed. Give him working torpedoes, and he would sink the entire Japanese merchant fleet. Wahoo was scheduled to exit the Sea of Japan through La Perouse Strait, the narrow passage between Hokkaido, Japan's northern island, and Sakhalin. She was supposed to transit the strait at sunset on October 21, and then radio confirmation that she had cleared the danger zone around October 23, when she reached open water beyond the Kuril Islands. The transmission never came. Japanese records captured after the war revealed what happened on October 11, 1943, 10 days before Wahoo was scheduled to leave. That morning, shore batteries at Cape Sawyer, Japan's northernmost point, spotted Wahoo on the surface and opened fire. She submerged immediately, diving to escape the shells. But something was wrong. She may have struck a mine while submerging. Instead of continuing east toward the exit strait, she reversed course and headed back into the Sea of Japan, trailing oil. Japanese anti-submarine aircraft sighted the oil slick and the telltale wake of a submarine running shallow. They radioed for assistance. Every available aircraft and patrol vessel in the region converged on Wahoo's position. What followed was a sustained 5-hour attack. Between 0945 and 1330, Wahoo endured 10 attack sorties from 5 aircraft, plus attacks from surface vessels, including submarine chasers and auxiliary minesweepers. At least 40 bombs and 69 depth charges rained down on the wounded submarine. By 12:30, oil streamed continuously from Wahoo's ruptured hull. The submarine was losing fuel, losing air, losing the ability to stay submerged. At 13:30, she stopped moving entirely. The screws fell silent. The boat hung motionless in the water, unable to run, unable to hide. At 16:30, 2 final bombs struck the stationary submarine. Wahoo erupted in what Japanese observers described as a froth of oil and compressed air. It was the death of a submarine, the final collapse of a pressure hull that had carried 79 men through 5 war patrols. All 79 crew members perished. Dudley Mush Morton died at 36 years old, commanding the boat he had made famous, in the waters where he had proven that American submarines could fight. Wahoo was declared overdue and presumed lost on December 2, 1943. She was stricken from the Naval Register on December 6. Morton and his crew were officially declared dead on January 7, 1946. The wreck was found more than 60 years later. In July 2006, a Russian dive team called Iskra from Vladivostok, led by retired naval captain Vladimir Kartashev, discovered Wahoo in 213 feet of water in La Perouse Strait, approximately 12 miles northeast of Cape Sawyer. The team had originally been searching for a lost Soviet submarine, but found Wahoo instead, resting on the ocean floor, where she had fallen more than 6 decades earlier. The United States Navy officially confirmed the identification on October 31, 2006. Admiral Gary Roughead, commander of the United States Pacific Fleet, made the announcement at a press conference in Hawaii. The submarine sits upright on the ocean floor, almost entirely intact, with a direct bomb hit visible near the conning tower confirming the cause of loss. Wahoo had become a war grave, protected by international law, a permanent memorial to the 79 men who gave their lives aboard her. The Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee conducted post-war analysis using captured Japanese records to verify what American submarines had actually sunk versus what they claimed during the war. Wartime claims were often inflated, not through dishonesty, but through the fog of combat, the difficulty of confirming kills through a periscope when you had to dive and run before the target went down. The JANAC analysis provided the definitive accounting. Under Morton's command, Wahoo sank 19 confirmed ships, totaling 54,683 tons. This placed Morton among the top submarine commanders of the war by number of vessels destroyed. The boat's total record, including the 1 ship sunk under her previous commander, reached 20 confirmed ships and over 60,000 tons. Morton's influence spread far beyond his own boat and his own executive officer. By the end of 1943, Admiral Lockwood had the aggressive commanders he desired in charge of nearly all vessels under his command. The cultural transformation of the submarine force was complete. The timid skippers had been weeded out. The men who remained had learned from Morton's example that the mission came first, that targets were meant to be sunk, that caution without purpose was just another word for failure. 30% of submarine skippers had been relieved in 1942 because they could not or would not fight aggressively. By 1944, American submarines were sinking nearly 500 Japanese ships per year. They would eventually destroy over 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping, strangling the island nation's economy and crippling its ability to wage war. The submarine campaign that failed in 1942 became the most successful naval operation of the Pacific War. Morton did not live to see this victory. He died in October 1943, with more than 2 years of war still ahead. But the men he trained and inspired carried his legacy forward. O'Kane in Tang, George Grider, who served under Morton on Wahoo's early patrols, later commanded USS Flasher to become the highest tonnage-scoring submarine of the war. The aggressive tactics that Morton pioneered became standard doctrine throughout the submarine force. Morton received 4 Navy Crosses, the 4th awarded posthumously. He received the Army Distinguished Service Cross from General MacArthur. USS Wahoo received the Presidential Unit Citation for her 3rd patrol. The destroyer USS Morton, a Forrest Sherman-class vessel, was commissioned on May 26, 1959, named in his honor. His daughter Edwina served as sponsor, christening the ship that carried her father's name. Perhaps the most remarkable memorial stands at Cape Sawyer itself, at the northernmost point of Japan, overlooking the waters where Wahoo met her end. On September 9, 1995, former Japanese attackers and American families gathered together to dedicate a monument of peace. The inscription reads, "When the Wahoo was lost, it was the highest scoring submarine in the United States Navy." 80 Americans sleep in the Sawyer Strait, 12 miles northeast of here. Many Japanese sleep in the Sea of Japan from Wahoo attacks. This monument was erected by the members of the Japanese attack group and relatives of Americans lying in Wahoo. Old enemies met as brothers to ensure that our countries will have lasting peace and war will never again destroy the friendship we enjoy today. Former enemies standing together, the men who killed and the families of the men who died, united in remembrance. Admiral Lockwood's assessment of Morton remains the definitive epitaph. When a natural leader and born daredevil, such as Mush Morton, is given command of a submarine, the result can only be a fighting ship of the highest order, with officers and men who would follow their skipper to the gates of hell. And they did. The transformation Morton brought to submarine warfare cannot be measured only in tonnage sunk or ships destroyed. He changed the culture of an entire military branch. He proved that cautious doctrine was not wisdom but cowardice dressed in regulations. He showed that American submarines and American sailors were capable of fighting with the same ferocity as any enemy, if only their leaders would let them fight. Before Morton took command of Wahoo, American submarines were failing their mission. After Morton, they became the most effective weapon in the Pacific arsenal. One man, in 10 months of command, demonstrated what was possible. The submarine force learned from his example and applied his lessons to win a war. The waters of La Perouse Strait are cold and dark. 213 feet below the surface, Wahoo rests where she fell, her hull still intact, and her crew still at their stations. The men who hunted her are gone now. The war they fought ended 8 decades ago. The enemies who faced each other across the Pacific became allies and trading partners. but the lessons Morton taught remain as relevant as they were in 1943. Victory goes to those who act. Doctrine is a guide, not a prison. The measure of a leader is not the safety of his command, but the accomplishment of his mission. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing at all. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you stories of courage and sacrifice that deserve to be remembered. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, veterans and history enthusiasts who share a passion for honoring those who served. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for keeping these stories alive. Dudley Mush Morton was 36 years old when he died. He commanded Wahoo for 10 months. In that time, he transformed American submarine warfare, inspired a generation of commanders, and proved that courage and conviction could overcome every obstacle except death itself. His grave is the Pacific Ocean. His monument stands where enemies became brothers. His legacy endures in the cold waters of Japan, where his ship keeps her eternal watch.